The dust had not even settled from the stagecoach robbery when Joseph Lawson realized the woman walking toward him across the sun-baked street of Redemption, Kansas, was about to change the entire course of his life, though he had no way of knowing it yet, only that she carried something wrapped in a faded blue blanket pressed tight against her chest, and that her eyes held the kind of grief that made even a man like him, a man who had buried more people than he cared to count, stop breathing for a moment. It was the spring of 1878, and Joseph Lawson had ridden into Redemption 3 days prior with nothing but a tired horse, 2 Colt revolvers, and a reputation that stretched from Dodge City to the Texas Panhandle. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and sorrow, and hands that had done things he tried not to think about after dark. He had come to Redemption because the town's mayor had wired ahead offering a bounty for the Kettering Gang, a band of outlaws who had been terrorizing the railroad line and the small settlements that depended on it. Joseph had taken the job because it was what he did. He hunted men for money, and he had told himself long ago that it was a fair trade, since the men he hunted deserved worse than what he gave them. He had killed 2 of the Kettering Gang the night before in a shootout behind the livery stable, and the town had celebrated him with free whiskey and admiring stares, the kind of attention he had grown numb to over the years. But now, standing in the middle of Main Street with the morning sun throwing long shadows across the packed dirt, he watched a woman approach him with a baby in her arms, and something in his chest tightened in a way that no gunfight had ever managed. Her name, though he did not know it yet, was Lucy Ford, and she was 26 years old, with hair the color of wheat left too long under an August sun, and a face that might have been beautiful in easier times but now looked hollowed out by exhaustion and loss. Her dress was simple, gray calico, patched at the hem, and her boots were caked with the red clay from the road that led north toward the Kettering Gang's old hideout, a road that Joseph knew well because he had ridden it just yesterday to end 3 lives. "Mr. Lawson," she said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable of his name, as though she had practiced saying it and still could not manage the weight of it. "You are the one they call the Gunslinger, the one who killed the men who took my husband." Joseph removed his hat, a reflex more than a decision, because something about the way she held herself, spine straight despite the trembling in her arms, demanded a kind of respect he did not often give to strangers. "Yes, ma'am, I did what the town paid me to do. My husband was Thomas Ford," she said. "He ran the general store here in Redemption. The Kettering Gang came through 8 days ago looking for money they thought he was hiding, and when he told them there was none, they shot him in front of me and our son, and then they rode off laughing like it was nothing at all." Her voice did not break as she said this, though her eyes glistened, and Joseph understood that she had likely told this story to herself so many times in the darkness of her grief that the words had worn smooth like river stones. "I am sorry for your loss," Joseph said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, because he had said them before to other widows, other orphan children, and they had always felt like small coins tossed into an ocean of sorrow. "I wish I could have gotten to them sooner." "You got 2 of them," Lucy said. "There is still one left, Amos Kettering himself. He is the one who pulled the trigger." She adjusted the blanket in her arms, and Joseph saw for the first time the small face peeking out from within it, a baby no older than 4 months, with dark tufts of hair and eyes the same startling blue as his mother's. "This is my son. His name is Daniel. He is a fine-looking boy," Joseph said, though he had little experience with infants and was not entirely sure what one was supposed to say about them. "I am leaving Redemption," Lucy said, and there was something final in the way she said it, something that made Joseph's stomach drop before he even understood why. "My sister lives in Abilene, and she has offered to take me in, but she cannot take a child that is not her own blood into a home already crowded with 5 children of her own and a husband who barely tolerates the ones he already has." Joseph did not understand what she was telling him until she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and held the baby out toward him with both arms extended, the way a person might offer up something too heavy to carry any farther. "I cannot raise him alone, Mr. Lawson. I have no husband, no money beyond what little Thomas left in the store's cash box, and no way to feed both myself and a child on the road to Abilene. You are a man who has shown he can protect people. You killed the men who murdered his father. I am asking you, I am begging you to take him." "Ma'am," Joseph said, and he took a step back as though the baby in her arms was something dangerous, though what he felt was not fear of the child but fear of himself, of what kind of man he had become, a man who dealt in death and violence and had no business holding something so fragile and new. "I am not fit to raise a child. I am a hired gun. I do not stay in one place more than a week at a time. I sleep in saddle blankets more often than beds." "Then you will learn to stay," Lucy said, and there were tears now finally sliding down her cheeks, though her voice remained steady, remarkably steady for a woman asking a stranger to take her only son. "Because I cannot. I have tried every night for 8 days to find another way, and there is none. My sister's husband already resents the children we have, and he made it clear there is no room for one more, especially not one so young he cannot even be put to work. I have no family here. Thomas's people are all back in Missouri, and I have not heard from them in years. You are the only person in this town who has shown me any kindness since my husband died, even if that kindness was paid for in bullets." Joseph looked down at the baby, at Daniel, whose small face was scrunched in the particular way infants have when they are deciding whether to cry, and something inside him, some door he had bolted shut years ago after leaving his own family behind in Missouri following the war, creaked open just a fraction of an inch. "Where will you go?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would not satisfy him. "Abilene, as I said. My sister will take me, just not the boy. I have made peace with it, Mr. Lawson, though it is not a peace that sits easy in my heart. I would rather leave him with a man who has shown he will fight for the innocent than watch him starve on the road or be given to strangers who might not care for him at all." She pushed the bundle closer to him, and before Joseph could form another protest, his arms had moved on their own, some instinct older than his years as a gunfighter taking over, and he found himself holding the baby, feeling the surprising warmth and weight of him, the way small fists curled against the rough fabric of his shirt. "Lucy," Joseph said, using her name for the first time, though he had heard someone call it out earlier when she had walked past the mercantile, "you cannot mean to just walk away. He is your son." "I mean to survive," Lucy said, and now her composure finally broke just slightly, a single sob escaping before she pressed her hand to her mouth to stop any more from following. "And I mean for him to survive too, which is more than I can guarantee if I keep him with me on a road with no money and no protection. Please, Mr. Lawson, please." And then, before Joseph could say another word, before he could set the baby back into her arms and insist she reconsider, Lucy Ford turned and walked away down the dusty street toward the stagecoach depot, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound that several townspeople paused in their morning errands to watch her go, though none of them moved to stop her, and none of them moved to help Joseph, who stood frozen in the street holding a baby that was not his, watching the only woman who had ever made his chest ache in exactly that particular way disappear around the corner of the feed store. He should have followed her. He would tell himself that for years afterward, that in the moment he should have run after her, baby and all, and insisted they figure out some other way. But in that moment, he was simply too stunned to move, and by the time his mind caught up with what had happened, the stagecoach bound for Abilene was already being loaded, and Lucy Ford was climbing aboard without so much as a backward glance, though Joseph would later learn, much later, that she had wept the entire journey and had looked back 100 times in her mind even if her body had refused to turn. The baby began to cry. Joseph stood in the middle of Main Street, holding a screaming infant, with no earthly idea what to do next, and the weight of the moment settled over him like a physical thing, heavier than any gun he had ever carried, heavier than any grief he had ever buried in unmarked graves along the trails he rode. A crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the sound of the crying baby and the sight of the notorious Gunslinger looking, for the first time since he had ridden into town, thoroughly and completely lost. "Mr. Lawson," said Sheriff Halloran, an older man with a gray mustache who had hired Joseph for the Kettering job, "what in the world are you doing with a baby?" "I'm not entirely certain, Sheriff," Joseph said, bouncing Daniel awkwardly against his shoulder in a motion he had seen mothers use though he had never attempted it himself. "It seems Mrs. Ford has left him in my care." "The widow Ford. She just left him with you and got on the stage." "That is precisely what happened, yes." The sheriff removed his hat and scratched at his balding head, clearly as baffled by the situation as Joseph was. "Well, I suppose you could bring him to the Sisters of Charity orphanage in Wichita. They take in children whose folks cannot care for them. It is not more than a day's ride." Joseph looked down at the baby in his arms, at Daniel, who had stopped crying now and was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, the kind of eyes that had not yet learned to be afraid of the world, and something in Joseph's chest twisted painfully. He thought of his own childhood, of a father who had drunk himself into an early grave and a mother who had died of fever when Joseph was barely older than this child now was, of being raised by an aunt who resented every mouthful of food he ate and every year he stayed under her roof. He thought of the orphanages he had passed on his travels, overcrowded and underfunded, children with hollow eyes and thin arms, and he thought of Lucy Ford's face as she had begged him to take her son rather than risk such a fate. "No," Joseph said, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice. "No, I do not believe I will be doing that, Sheriff." "Then what exactly do you intend to do with him?" Joseph looked down Main Street toward the depot, where the stagecoach carrying Lucy Ford was already becoming a small cloud of dust on the horizon, and he felt something shift inside him, some fundamental recalibration of who he was and what his life was going to be from this moment forward. He had spent 15 years hunting men for money, sleeping under strange skies, drinking away the memories of the faces of men he had killed, and he had told himself that this was simply the shape of his life, unchangeable as the mountains. But standing there with a baby in his arms, a baby whose mother had trusted him, a near stranger over any other option available to her, he understood with sudden and total clarity that his life was about to become something entirely different. "I intend to raise him," Joseph said. "I do not know how exactly, but I intend to try." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly a smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I will be damned." The gunslinger, retiring on account of a baby. "It would seem so, Sheriff," Joseph said, and he found, to his own great surprise, that the idea did not frighten him nearly as much as it should have. He spent that first night in a room above the Redemption Saloon, having borrowed a wooden crate from the general store, and lined it with borrowed blankets to serve as a makeshift crib, and he did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch, startled awake each time by Daniel's cries, uncertain whether the boy was hungry or wet or simply frightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. By morning, Joseph had visited 3 different houses in town seeking advice from women who had raised children of their own, had purchased a tin of condensed milk and a rubber nursing bottle from the general store, now run by a clerk who had worked for Thomas Ford and had agreed to keep the shop running until someone else could take it over, and had learned, through trial and considerable error, how to change a diaper made from torn strips of an old shirt. It was Widow Callahan, a woman in her 50s who ran the boarding house at the edge of town, who took the greatest pity on him. She had raised 6 children of her own, 4 of whom had survived to adulthood, and she watched Joseph struggling with the makeshift bottle for perhaps 30 seconds before she took both baby and bottle from his hands with the practiced efficiency of long experience. "You are holding him like he might explode, Mr. Lawson," she said, settling into a rocking chair on her porch and adjusting Daniel against her arm in a way that made the whole process look effortless. Babies know when you are afraid of them. They can feel it in your arms. I have faced down armed men without half this much fear, Mrs. Callahan, Joseph admitted, sitting on the porch step beside her. But I confess this small person terrifies me considerably more. Widow Callahan laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the porch. That is because armed men, you know what they want. Money or your life or someone else's life. But a baby, he cannot tell you what he needs. You have to learn to read him, same as you would read a trail, I suppose, if that helps you any. It helps some, Joseph said, and he watched with something like wonder as Daniel drank from the bottle, his small hands wrapped around Mrs. Callahan's weathered finger. I do not suppose you would be willing to teach me. I intend to keep him, Mrs. Callahan, but I confess I have not the first idea how a man alone is meant to raise an infant. You are planning to stay in Redemption, then? Joseph considered this question for a long moment, looking out at the town, at the wide dirt street lined with false-fronted buildings, the church steeple visible above the rooftops, the distant line of the railroad tracks that had brought both prosperity and outlaws to this small corner of Kansas. He thought of his life on the trail, the bounties, the loneliness of campfires with no company but his horse and his thoughts, and he thought of the baby now sleeping contentedly in Mrs. Callahan's arms, and he made a decision that would alter the entire remaining course of his life. Yes, he said, I believe I am. He used the bounty money from the Kettering job, minus the amount still owed for Amos Kettering himself, who remained at large, to purchase a small piece of land just outside of town, a modest homestead with a 2-room cabin and a barn that had seen better days, previously owned by a farmer who had given up on the Kansas soil and moved west to try his luck in Colorado. It was not much, but it was solid, and it was his, and more importantly, it was a place where a child could grow up with room to run and fresh air to breathe and a father. If that was truly what Joseph was becoming, who would be there every morning and every night? The town of Redemption watched with a mixture of curiosity and amusement as the notorious gunslinger traded his reputation for diapers and a rocking chair he built himself out of scrap lumber, following instructions given to him with great patience by Widow Callahan. Some of the men who had known Joseph's reputation, who had heard tales of his gunfights from Dodge City to the Texas Panhandle, could not quite reconcile the stories with the sight of him walking through town with a baby strapped to his chest in a sling fashioned from an old horse blanket. But the women of the town, many of them mothers themselves, watched him with softening eyes, recognizing in his clumsy devotion something rare and worth admiring. Joseph named the boy's full name Daniel Thomas Ford, keeping the Ford name in honor of the father Daniel would never know, though as the months passed and Joseph's love for the child deepened into something as fierce and unshakable as anything he had ever felt, he began to think of Daniel as his own son in every way that mattered, even as he carried, always, a quiet ache for the mother who had walked away, wondering where she was, whether she was safe, whether she ever thought of the son she had given up. He did not have to wonder about Amos Kettering for long. 6 weeks after Lucy Ford had placed her son in his arms, word reached Redemption that Kettering had been spotted robbing a bank in a town called Millbrook, some 40 miles south, and Sheriff Halloran came to Joseph's small homestead with an offer that made Joseph's jaw tighten with old, familiar tension. There is a reward out for him now, dead or alive, put up by the bank and the railroad both, the sheriff said, standing awkwardly in Joseph's yard while Daniel, now 6 months old and beginning to show the beginnings of a personality, sat propped against a fence post on a blanket, watching a hen peck at the dirt nearby. $500, Mr. Lawson. That is more money than most men see in 2 years of honest work. Joseph looked at his son, at the small, determined face that was beginning to show hints of dark hair growing thick and curly, and he thought about the promise he had made to himself the day Lucy had walked away, the promise that he would retire the gun and become something safer, something a child could rely on without fear that his father might not return from the next job. "I appreciate the offer, Sheriff," Joseph said, "but I have hung up that particular trade. I am a farmer now, or at least I am trying to become one, and I have a son who needs his father alive and present rather than chasing down bounties across the state." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from disappointment to something closer to respect. "That is a fair answer, Mr. Lawson, and I will not press you further on it. Though I confess, watching you with that boy, I begin to think you have found something more valuable than any reward money the railroad could offer." "I believe I have, Sheriff," Joseph said, and he meant it with his whole heart. Amos Kettering was eventually captured by a posse from Millbrook and hanged for his crimes that same autumn, and though Joseph felt a grim satisfaction at the news, knowing that the man who had killed Thomas Ford and orphaned Daniel had finally faced justice, he found that his days were too full of the immediate concerns of raising a child to dwell long on matters of vengeance. There were chickens to feed and eggs to gather, a garden to plant despite his complete ignorance of farming, and a son who was beginning to crawl, and then, by the time winter's first snow dusted the Kansas plains, beginning to pull himself up on unsteady legs to stand. Joseph learned to cook, badly at first and then with gradually improving skill, thanks in large part to the patient instruction of Widow Callahan, who visited twice a week ostensibly to check on the baby, but who Joseph suspected simply enjoyed the company of a man who listened to her stories with genuine interest. He learned to sew, clumsily mending small clothes that Daniel seemed to outgrow with alarming speed, and he learned the particular rhythms of a child's needs, the way a certain cry meant hunger, and another meant tiredness, and a third, the most heart-wrenching of all, simply meant the boy wanted to be held. He thought of Lucy Ford often, more often than he might have expected given that they had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes total in the whole of their acquaintance. He wondered if she had made it safely to Abilene, whether her sister's household had welcomed her, whether she had found some measure of peace after the horror of watching her husband murdered before her eyes. He wondered, too, with a guilt he could not quite shake, whether she ever regretted the choice she had made, whether she lay awake at night thinking of the son she had given away to a stranger with a gun and a reputation for violence. It was in the spring of 1879, nearly a full year after Lucy had placed Daniel in his arms and walked away, that Joseph received a letter that would change everything once again. The letter arrived by way of the Redemption Post Office, addressed in careful, feminine handwriting to Mr. Joseph Lawson, Redemption, Kansas, and Joseph's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, some instinct telling him before he even read the first line who it might be from. "Dear Mr. Lawson," the letter began, "I do not know if this correspondence will find you still in Redemption, or if you have moved on as men of your former profession often do, but I felt compelled to write regardless, if only to ease a burden that has weighed on my conscience every day since I left my son in your care. I think of Daniel every single day, Mr. Lawson. I think of his face, of the weight of him in my arms, and I wonder if I made the right choice in leaving him with you, a man I barely knew, rather than finding some other way to keep him with me. My sister's household in Abilene has proven difficult, as I feared it might, and I have taken work as a seamstress to support myself, though the wages are meager and my brother-in-law's patience with my continued presence grows thinner with each passing month. I do not write this letter to ask anything of you, Mr. Lawson, only to ask if you might tell me how my son fares, whether he is healthy, whether he is happy, whether the choice I made, the hardest choice of my life, was the right one after all. Yours in gratitude and sorrow, Lucy Ford." Joseph read the letter 3 times, sitting at the small wooden table in his cabin while Daniel napped in the next room, and by the third reading, he found his eyes had grown wet in a way he was not accustomed to. having spent so many years training himself out of any display of emotion that might be perceived as weakness by the men he hunted or the men who hunted him. He wrote back that very evening, staying up late by lamplight to compose a letter that took him nearly 3 hours to finish, crossing out sentences and starting again, wanting desperately to convey both the truth of Daniel's thriving happiness and the truth of his own complicated feelings toward the woman who had entrusted him with her son. "Dear Mrs. Ford," he wrote, "your son is well, and more than well, he is thriving. He has grown so much you would scarcely recognize him. He has 6 teeth now, and a laugh that fills this entire cabin with warmth. He pulls himself up on the furniture and takes wobbling steps when he thinks no one is watching, though he still prefers to crawl when he believes speed is of the essence. He has your eyes, Mrs. Ford, the same striking blue, and when he looks up at me with them, I confess I see you in him every single day. I have given up the gun entirely, as I promised myself I would the day you placed him in my arms. I farm now, though I am not particularly skilled at it, and the town has been kind to us both, offering more help and patience than I likely deserve given my former profession. I do not believe you made the wrong choice, Mrs. Ford, though I understand the sorrow that must accompany such a decision regardless of its wisdom. Daniel is safe and loved, and if it would ease your heart to know it, I would welcome the chance to correspond further, or even, should you ever find yourself able to travel, to see for yourself how he has grown. Yours sincerely, Joseph Lawson." The letters that followed over the next several months became the thread that Joseph found himself most looking forward to each week, more so even than the satisfaction of a successful harvest, or the joy of watching Daniel's first unsteady steps become confident, running strides. Lucy wrote of her difficult circumstances in Abilene, of the seamstress work that paid poorly but at least kept her fed and sheltered, of her growing estrangement from her sister's husband, who made no secret of his desire to see her find other lodging. Joseph wrote of Daniel's growth, of small triumphs and small setbacks, of the particular way the boy had begun to say a word that sounded remarkably like "pa," though Joseph tried not to read too much significance into the babbling of a not yet 2-year-old. But beneath the practical exchange of information about Daniel's development, something else was growing in those letters, something neither of them named directly, but which colored every sentence with a warmth that went beyond mere politeness. Joseph found himself telling Lucy things he had never told another living soul, about his childhood in Missouri, about the war that had taken his youth and turned him toward violence as a trade, about the years of loneliness on the trail that had left him hollow in ways he had not fully understood, until Daniel's presence had begun to fill those empty spaces. Lucy, in turn, wrote of her own childhood in Ohio, of meeting Thomas Ford at a church social and falling in love with his gentle humor, of the grief that still visited her some nights though it had begun, slowly, to loosen its grip on her heart. By the autumn of 1879, 18 months after that fateful day on Main Street, Joseph found himself composing a letter unlike any of the others, his hand hesitating over the paper as he tried to find the right words for what he wanted to say. "Dear Lucy," he wrote, abandoning the formality of Mrs. Ford that he had maintained in every previous letter, "I have thought long and hard about how to say what I am about to say, and I confess I have started this letter no fewer than 6 times before settling on these words. I do not believe I am the same man who watched you walk away from me on Main Street 18 months ago. That man was hollow, Lucy, hollow in ways I did not even recognize until your son began to fill the empty spaces inside me. I have come to love Daniel as though he were my own flesh and blood, and I do not believe that love could be any less complete had I fathered him myself. But I have also come to realize, through the words you have shared with me in every letter these past months, that my heart has grown to hold feelings for you as well, feelings that go beyond gratitude for entrusting me with your son, feelings I am not certain I have any right to express given the circumstances of our acquaintance, but which I can no longer keep silent. I would be honored, Lucy, more honored than I have any right to expect, if you would consider coming to redemption, not merely to see your son, but to see whether the connection we have built through these letters might grow into something more, should you find yourself willing. I understand if this request is too forward, too presumptuous given how little time we have spent in each other's actual company. But I have learned, in the quiet hours of raising your son, that life is too short and too uncertain to leave such feelings unspoken. Yours, with more hope than I have felt in many years, Joseph. He sent the letter with trembling hands, uncertain whether he had overstepped some boundary that would end their correspondence entirely, uncertain whether Lucy's feelings, whatever they might be, extended anywhere near the depth of his own. He waited 2 full weeks for a response, each day checking the post office with an anxiety he had not felt even in the moments before a gunfight, and when the letter finally arrived, he could hardly bring himself to open it, so afraid was he that it might contain a gentle but firm rejection. Instead, when he finally gathered the courage to break the seal and read Lucy's response, he found his eyes filling with tears for the second time in their correspondence. "Dear Joseph," she had written, and the simple use of his first name alone told him something important had shifted between them. "I have read your letter perhaps 20 times since it arrived, and each time I read it, my heart beats faster than the last. I did not expect, when I placed my son in your arms that terrible day, that I would ever find myself falling in love with the man I had chosen almost at random to save him. But that is precisely what has happened, Joseph, over these many months of letters, as I have come to know your heart through your words, your patience with Daniel, your honesty about your own fears and failures. I have wondered many nights whether it would be foolish to hope for more than friendship between us, given the strange circumstances of how we came to know each other. But your letter has given me the courage to admit what I have felt for some months now. I would very much like to come to redemption, Joseph, not only to see my son, whom I have missed every single day since I left him with you, but to see whether what has grown between us in these letters might become something real, something lasting. I have saved a small amount of money from my seamstress work, enough for a train ticket, and if you are still willing, I could arrive within the month. Yours, with a heart full of hope I thought I had lost forever, Lucy." Joseph read this letter standing in the doorway of his cabin, with Daniel, now nearly 2 years old and full of the boundless energy of toddlerhood, tugging at his trouser leg demanding attention, and he found himself laughing and crying simultaneously, a combination of emotions so foreign to his experience that he hardly knew what to do with himself. He scooped Daniel up into his arms and spun him around the small yard, the boy shrieking with delighted laughter, and Joseph felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that his life was about to become everything he had never known he wanted. The weeks leading up to Lucy's arrival passed both too slowly and too quickly for Joseph's peace of mind. He found himself repairing every loose board in the cabin, whitewashing the walls, planting flowers along the front path though he had no particular knowledge of gardening, and relied heavily on advice from Widow Callahan, who had become something of a confidant regarding the entire situation, and who watched Joseph's nervous preparations with amused affection. "You are behaving like a man courting for the first time," she told him one afternoon, as she watched him attempt to straighten a fence post that had leaned for 2 years without bothering him in the slightest until now. "I suppose I am, Mrs. Callahan," Joseph admitted, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. "I have faced armed outlaws with steadier hands than I have facing the prospect of Lucy Ford stepping off that train. That is because outlaws, you understood. This, you do not yet understand, and that not knowing is what makes the heart tremble so." She smiled and patted his arm with the same gentle affection she showed toward Daniel. "It will be well, Joseph. I have watched you raise that boy with more tenderness than I have seen from many men who fathered their children by blood rather than by circumstance. Any woman would be fortunate to build a life alongside a man such as you have become. On the day Lucy's train was due to arrive, Joseph dressed Daniel in his finest clothes, a small suit that Widow Callahan had sewn for the occasion, and drove them both into town in the wagon he had purchased the previous spring. His stomach twisted into knots that no amount of reassurance from Mrs. Callahan or the sheriff, who had also grown fond of Joseph and his son over the past 18 months, could fully untangle. The train arrived precisely on schedule, its whistle echoing across the Kansas plains, and Joseph stood on the platform with Daniel balanced on his hip, watching the passengers disembark one by one, his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity he had not felt since the earliest days of his gunfighting career, when every job carried the genuine possibility of death. And then he saw her. Lucy Ford stepped down from the train wearing a traveling dress of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, her wheat-colored hair pinned up beneath a modest hat, and though 18 months had passed since Joseph had last seen her, though grief had once carved deep lines into her face on that terrible day in redemption, he saw now that time and hope had softened those lines, had restored some of the color to her cheeks that shock and sorrow had stolen away. For a long moment, neither of them moved, simply staring at each other across the platform, and then Lucy's eyes fell to the child in Joseph's arms, and her hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped her, though this time it was clearly a sob of joy rather than grief. "Daniel," she whispered, and though the boy could not possibly remember his mother from a time when he had been only months old, he seemed to sense the significance of the moment, reaching out toward her with small, chubby arms as though some deep instinct recognized the woman who had carried him into the world. Joseph closed the distance between them, and when he placed Daniel into Lucy's arms, the mirror image of that terrible day 18 months prior struck them both with such force that they stood frozen for a long moment, Lucy weeping openly now as she pressed kisses to her son's dark curls, Joseph watching with his own eyes wet, understanding that this moment, unlike the last, was one of joyful reunion rather than devastating separation. "He is so big," Lucy managed to say between tears. "He is so beautiful, Joseph. You have done such a wonderful job with him." "We have both done a wonderful job with him," Joseph said gently, "though I confess the past 18 months would have gone considerably easier with your guidance from the start." Lucy laughed through her tears, a sound Joseph had not heard before but which he decided immediately was among the most beautiful he had ever encountered. "I do not believe you needed much guidance, Joseph Lawson. Your letters told me everything I needed to know about the kind of father you have become." They stood on that platform for a long while, simply looking at each other, at the child between them who represented both the tragedy that had brought them together and the hope that had grown from it. And Joseph felt something settle deep in his chest, a certainty that had been building for months through every letter, every shared confidence, every careful revelation of hearts that had both known too much loss and were now daring to hope for something better. "Will you come home with us?" Joseph asked, and the question carried far more weight than its simple words might suggest. "Not merely to visit, Lucy, but to stay, if that is something you might want. I know we have only known each other properly through letters, and I know it may seem hasty to speak of such things so soon after your arrival, but I find I cannot pretend otherwise. I have fallen in love with you, Lucy Ford, through every word you have written to me these past months, and I would be honored beyond measure if you would allow me to court you properly, here in Redemption, with your son, our son, growing up in a home with both of us to love him." Lucy looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made Joseph feel as though she could see straight through to his very soul, and then she smiled, a smile that seemed to banish the last remaining shadows of grief from her features. "I would like nothing more, Joseph. I have loved you too, though I confess it terrified me to admit it even to myself. I did not think I would ever love again after losing Thomas, but you have shown me, through your patience and your kindness toward my son, that love can grow again in unexpected soil." They rode back to the homestead together, Lucy holding Daniel close against her chest, marveling at every small detail of him, the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck, the way he had begun to form actual words rather than mere babbling, the particular giggle that emerged when Joseph made a silly face at him. When they arrived at the cabin, Lucy walked through every room with tears in her eyes, seeing the small touches Joseph had added over the months, the crib he had built by hand, the collection of small toys carved from wood, a rocking horse that Joseph had spent an entire winter constructing. "You built all of this for him," Lucy said, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the rocking horse, "for a son that was not even yours by blood. He became mine the moment you placed him in my arms," Joseph said simply. "I did not choose to become a father that day, but I have never once regretted the choice that was made for me." Lucy moved to stand before him, close enough that Joseph could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap that clung to her traveling dress. "And what of the choice before you now, Joseph? What of choosing not merely to be Daniel's father, but to build a life alongside his mother?" "That," Joseph said, reaching up to gently cup her face in his weathered hand, "is the easiest choice I have ever made." He kissed her then, softly at first, tentatively, as though testing whether this moment they had both hoped for through months of careful letters could truly bear the weight of physical reality. And when Lucy responded with equal tenderness, deepening the kiss with a sigh that seemed to release months of accumulated longing, Joseph understood that whatever violence and loneliness had marked his previous years, whatever darkness had followed him across the plains as a hired gun, all of it had led, improbably and miraculously, to this moment, to this woman, to this small family formed from tragedy but growing now into something beautiful. Lucy stayed in redemption, taking a room at Widow Callahan's boarding house while she and Joseph properly courted, as was expected by the standards of the town and the era, though both of them found the formal distance almost unbearable given the depth of feeling that had grown between them through their correspondence. They spent every possible moment together over the following months: walks along the creek that ran behind Joseph's property, quiet evenings on the porch after Daniel had been put to bed, Sunday dinners that gradually became a fixture of town life, as Redemption watched with warm approval the courtship of the reformed Gunslinger and the widow whose son he had raised. Sheriff Halloran officiated their wedding in the spring of 1880, exactly 2 years after that fateful day on Main Street when Lucy had placed her son in Joseph's arms and walked away. The ceremony took place in the small church at the center of Redemption, the same church whose steeple Joseph had glimpsed from his cabin porch on countless mornings, wondering if he might ever find the kind of peace and belonging that a proper family might offer. Widow Callahan had helped Lucy sew a wedding dress from fabric purchased with the last of her seamstress savings, a simple but elegant gown that made Lucy look, in Joseph's admittedly biased opinion, like the most beautiful woman who had ever walked the earth. Daniel, now 2.5 years old, stood between them during the ceremony, having insisted on being included rather than left in the care of Widow Callahan's granddaughter. And when the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the boy's clear voice piped up with an enthusiastic "no." That sent ripples of laughter through the gathered congregation, breaking whatever remaining tension lingered from the formal solemnity of the occasion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said, and Joseph Lawson, former gunslinger, feared across half the Kansas plains for his skill with a Colt revolver, kissed his bride with a tenderness that surprised even himself, a tenderness born from months of careful courtship and years of learning, through raising her son, exactly what kind of love a person could build when they finally chose peace over violence, family over solitude, hope over the endless grinding loneliness of the trail. Their life together in the years that followed was not without its ordinary hardships, for the Kansas plains offered no guarantees of easy fortune to any farmer, And Joseph learned through hard experience the particular challenges of drought years and grasshopper plagues that could destroy a season's crops within days. But he faced these challenges now with a partner beside him, and Lucy proved herself remarkably capable, having grown up on a small farm in Ohio before her family had moved to town, and together they built their homestead into something that provided steadily, if not lavishly, for their growing family. In the autumn of 1881, Lucy gave birth to a son, whom they named William Joseph Lawson, a boy who arrived squalling into the world with a full head of dark hair much like his older brothers. And Joseph found himself once again overwhelmed by the particular terror and joy of holding a newborn, though this time he had Lucy beside him to guide his uncertain hands. And this time, he thought with quiet gratitude, he would not have to learn fatherhood entirely alone. 2 years after William's arrival, in the summer of 1883, their family grew once more with the birth of a daughter, Sarah Grace Lawson, who arrived with her mother's wheat-colored hair. And as she grew, her mother's steady determination, though she possessed also a stubborn streak that both her parents privately agreed she had inherited from her father, though neither would ever admit it directly to the other. Daniel grew into a thoughtful, gentle boy who showed an early fascination with horses, spending long hours in the barn with the animals that Joseph kept. And though he was old enough by the time William and Sarah arrived to understand, in the way that children slowly come to understand such things, that Joseph was not his father by blood, the knowledge never diminished the bond between them in the slightest. Joseph had told him the truth when Daniel was old enough to ask questions, sitting the boy down on the porch steps one evening when he was 6 years old and explaining, with as much gentleness as he could muster, the circumstances of his birth and his mother's difficult choice. "Your first father, Thomas Ford, was a good man," Joseph told him, "and he loved your mother very much, and he loved you too, though he did not have the chance to know you for very long before he was taken from this world. Your mother made a very hard choice, Daniel, the hardest choice a mother could ever make when she gave you into my care. She did not do it because she did not love you. She did it because she loved you so much that she was willing to give up the chance to raise you herself, so that you might have a better chance at a good life than she believed she could provide alone." Daniel had considered this with the particular seriousness that even young children sometimes possess when confronting matters of genuine importance. "But you are my father now," he said, not quite a question, more a statement seeking confirmation. "I am your father in every way that matters," Joseph confirmed, "and I will be your father for as long as I live, Daniel. That will never change, regardless of what you learn about how our family came to be." This conversation seemed to settle something in the boy's mind, and though he occasionally asked further questions as he grew older, about Thomas Ford, about the circumstances of his death, about what his mother's life had been like in those difficult months before Joseph and Lucy's reunion, he never showed any confusion about where his loyalty and love belonged, embracing both Joseph and Lucy with the complete devotion that children reserve for parents who have earned that trust through years of consistent care. The town of Redemption watched the Lawson family grow and flourish over the following years, with the particular satisfaction that small communities take in witnessing a genuine love story unfold in their midst. Joseph's homestead expanded as his farming skills improved and his family grew, and he eventually purchased additional acreage that allowed him to run a modest herd of cattle alongside his crops, providing a comfortable if unpretentious living for his growing family. Lucy, for her part, opened a small dressmaking shop in town, putting her seamstress skills to good use while also providing a service that Redemption had previously lacked. And her shop became something of a gathering place for the women of the town, who came not only for her excellent needlework but for her warm company and ready laughter. In 1885, 7 years after that fateful day on Main Street, Joseph found himself standing once again in nearly the same spot where Lucy had first placed Daniel in his arms. though this time the occasion was considerably happier, as the whole town had gathered to celebrate Redemption's 10th anniversary as an incorporated settlement, and Joseph had been asked to say a few words as one of the town's most respected citizens. A transformation so complete from his early reputation as a feared gunslinger that even he sometimes marveled at how thoroughly his life had changed. 7 years ago, Joseph told the gathered crowd, with Lucy standing beside him holding baby Sarah while Daniel, now 9 years old, stood proudly at his father's side, and 6-year-old William tugged impatiently at his mother's skirt. I rode into this town as a man who dealt only in violence, who had no roots and no reasons to stay anywhere for very long. I believed, foolishly, that this was simply the shape my life was destined to take, that I had no capacity for anything beyond the trade I had learned during hard years on the trail. He paused, looking down at his family, at Lucy's encouraging smile, at Daniel's proud face, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion that he no longer felt any need to hide, not in this town that had watched him transform, not before this woman who had taught him what it meant to truly live rather than merely survive. But this town, and one particular woman within it, showed me that a man's past does not have to determine his future. I retired my gun the very moment a grieving widow placed her son in my arms and asked me to give him a better chance at life than she believed she could provide. I did not know in that moment that I was also being given a better chance at life myself, a chance to become something more than a hired killer, a chance to become a father and eventually a husband, and to build a family in a town that welcomed a stranger with a violent past and helped him become someone worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. He looked at Lucy then, and though he had planned to say more, prepared remarks about the town's growth and prosperity, he found the words abandoning him in favor of simpler, more heartfelt truth. I love this town, and I love this family, and I would not trade a single moment of the life we have built here for anything the world might offer. Thank you, Redemption, for giving a broken man the chance to become whole. The crowd's applause was warm and genuine, and as Joseph stepped down from the small platform that had been erected for the occasion, Lucy met him with tears in her eyes, and Daniel wrapped his arms around his father's waist with the fierce affection of a boy who had never known any father but this one. And William demanded to be lifted onto Joseph's shoulders so he could see over the crowd, and baby Sarah gurgled happily at the noise and excitement surrounding her, and Joseph Lawson, former gunslinger, feared bounty hunter, killer of outlaws across half of Kansas, felt more complete and more at peace than he had ever imagined possible in those long, lonely years riding the trails with nothing but his guns and his grief for company. That evening, after the celebrations had concluded and the children had been put to bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, Joseph and Lucy sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the Kansas plains in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, the same view Joseph had watched countless times over the years but which never failed to move him, particularly now that he had someone to share it with. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lucy asked quietly, her head resting against his shoulder as they rocked gently in the chairs Joseph had built with his own hands. "The day I walked away from you on Main Street." "I think about it often," Joseph admitted. "I think about how frightened you must have been, how desperate to place your son in the arms of a stranger and simply walk away, trusting that it would be for the best." "I think about it too," Lucy said, "though these days I think of it with gratitude rather than the shame I carried for so long afterward. I convinced myself for many months that I was a terrible mother for making that choice, that a good mother would have found some other way, any other way, to keep her child with her regardless of the hardship." Joseph took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the ease of long familiarity. "You were the best mother imaginable, Lucy. You looked at an impossible situation and made the hardest choice a person could make, not because you did not love your son, but because you loved him more than you loved your own comfort, more than you loved your own pride. That is not the mark of a terrible mother. That is the mark of an extraordinary one." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I do not think I could have survived those months in Abilene, not knowing, without your letters, Joseph. Every week, hearing about Daniel's growth, his laughter, his first steps, it was the only thing that kept me from despair entirely. And then gradually, your letters became about more than just Daniel. They became about you, about your thoughts and your fears and the quiet strength I saw growing in you as you took on this responsibility you never expected to carry. You saved me," Joseph said simply. "I do not think you fully understand that, Lucy. I was a hollow man before Daniel came into my life, before you came into my life. I had spent so many years dealing in death that I had forgotten what it felt like to build something rather than destroy it. You gave me the chance to become a builder again, of a home, of a family, of a life worth living rather than merely surviving." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky, and then Lucy spoke again, her voice softer now, carrying a hint of something Joseph recognized as excitement mixed with nervousness. "Joseph, I have something to tell you." "What is it?" "I am expecting again. Dr. Simmons confirmed it just yesterday, though I wanted to wait for the right moment to tell you. And I confess I could not think of a better moment than this one, sitting here together after such a meaningful day." Joseph felt his heart swell with a joy that had become familiar to him over the years of their marriage, but which never diminished in its intensity with each repetition. "Another child," he said, wonder evident in his voice despite the fact that this would be their third child together, fourth if one counted Daniel, which Joseph always did without hesitation or qualification. "Lucy, that is wonderful news." "I was hoping you would think so," Lucy said, smiling up at him in the darkness. "Though I confess, I sometimes wonder if we are growing our family faster than this small homestead can comfortably accommodate." "We will build another room," Joseph said decisively. "We have managed every challenge that has come our way thus far, Lucy. I do not doubt for a moment that we will manage this one as well." Their fourth child, a daughter they named Grace Elizabeth Lawson, was born in the spring of 1886, completing what Joseph and Lucy had come to think of as their family, though they would later joke that they had not entirely planned to stop at 4 children. Circumstances, and the particular exhaustion of raising 4 young ones, simply making the decision for them in the years that followed. Daniel grew into young manhood over the subsequent years, developing into a fine horseman who eventually took over much of the responsibility for the family's growing cattle herd, showing a natural talent for the work that made Joseph immensely proud, though he was equally proud of William's growing interest in Lucy's dressmaking business, the boy showing an unexpected aptitude for sketching designs that Lucy incorporated into her most popular creations, and of Sarah's fierce intelligence that led her to become one of the finest students the Redemption Schoolhouse had ever produced, and of little Grace's boundless energy and curiosity about every living creature she encountered, whether the family's chickens, the neighbors' dogs, or the wild birds that nested in the trees along the creek. In 1889, when Daniel turned 13 years old, he asked Joseph a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind for some time, as they worked together mending fence along the eastern edge of the property. "Pa," he said, using the term he had called Joseph for as long as he could remember, "do you ever hear from my mother? My first mother, I mean. The one who died before I could remember her." The question caught Joseph slightly off guard, though he had long expected that Daniel would eventually want to know more about Thomas Ford, the father he had lost before he could form any memories of him. "Your mother, Lucy, is the only mother you have ever known, Daniel, and she loves you every bit as much as she loves William and Sarah and Grace. But I understand you are asking about Thomas Ford, your first father." "Yes," Daniel said. "I suppose that is what I meant. Mother has told me some about him, about how kind he was, how he used to sing to her when they worked together in the store. But I wonder sometimes what he would think of the man I am becoming, whether he would be proud of me. Joseph set down his tools and looked at his son, at the boy who had grown so much taller in recent years, whose face had begun to show the first hints of the man he would become. I believe Thomas Ford would be enormously proud of you, Daniel. Any father would be proud to see the young man you have become, hardworking and honest and kind to everyone you meet. I did not know Thomas Ford personally, but I believe any father, blood or otherwise, would recognize in you all the best qualities a person could hope to pass on to their child. Daniel nodded slowly, seeming to find comfort in this answer. I am glad you took me in. Pa, I know Mother has told me the story many times, how she had no other choice, how desperate the circumstances were. But I am glad it was you she chose to trust with me, rather than sending me to an orphanage or some other stranger. I am glad as well, Daniel, Joseph said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Taking you into my arms that day changed the entire course of my life, for the better in every possible way. I do not believe I would have found your mother, my Lucy, without you bringing us together first. You gave me a reason to become a better man, and everything good that has come into my life since that day, I owe in some measure to you. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of William, now 8 years old and full of the particular energy that seemed to characterize him from birth, running across the field to inform them that supper was ready, and that Lucy had made Daniel's favorite dish in honor of his upcoming birthday. The three of them walked back toward the house together, Daniel's arms slung casually around William's shoulders in the easy affection of brothers who had never known any other configuration of family than the one they currently possessed. The years continued to pass with the particular rhythm of frontier life, seasons of drought followed by seasons of abundance, small crises that seemed enormous in the moment, but which the family weathered together with the resilience that had become their hallmark. Redemption itself grew alongside them, the railroad bringing increased prosperity and new settlers, the small town gradually transforming into something closer to a proper city, with a new schoolhouse, a proper hospital replacing the previous arrangement of relying on Dr. Simmons's limited resources, and eventually even a small college that Daniel would attend for a year before deciding that ranching suited him better than academic pursuits. Joseph never returned to his former profession, never picked up his guns again except for the occasional necessity of hunting or protecting his livestock from predators, and though occasionally younger men in town, having heard tales of his former reputation, would ask him about his gunfighting days with a kind of eager curiosity, Joseph found he had little interest in reliving those memories, preferring instead to focus on the life he had built rather than the life he had left behind. Was it hard? Sarah asked him once, when she was perhaps 12 years old and had recently learned more details of her father's past from other children in town whose parents remembered the gunslinger who had settled in Redemption, giving up your old life so suddenly. Did you miss it? Joseph considered this question carefully, wanting to give his daughter an honest answer rather than simply the comfortable version of events that made for a tidier story. I will not pretend the transition was easy, Sarah. I had spent 15 years of my life defining myself by my skill with a gun, by my ability to survive in a violent world through violence of my own. Giving that up meant giving up a part of my identity that I had clung to for a very long time, even though that identity brought me little genuine happiness. But you do not miss it now. No, Joseph said with complete certainty. I do not miss it at all, not for a single moment. Every morning I wake up beside your mother. Every evening I watch you and your brothers and sister grow and thrive. I understand more deeply how much richer this life is than anything my old profession could have offered me. I traded loneliness and violence for love and family, Sarah, and that is not a trade I would ever wish to reverse. By 1895, 17 years after that fateful day, when Lucy had placed baby Daniel in Joseph's arms, The Lawson family had become one of the most respected in Redemption, their homestead having grown into a substantial ranch that provided not only for their own needs, but employment for several hired hands, many of whom Joseph had specifically sought out among former soldiers or drifters who, like himself many years before, needed a second chance and a place to build something better than the violence and uncertainty of their previous circumstances. Daniel, now 19 years old, had fallen in love with a young woman named Emily Hartwell, whose family had recently settled in Redemption after her father took a position managing the local bank, and Joseph found himself experiencing the particular bittersweet pride of watching his eldest son court a young woman with the same earnest sincerity that Joseph himself had once shown toward Lucy, though through letters rather than the more traditional courtship that Daniel and Emily enjoyed. Having grown up in the same small town and attended the same schoolhouse functions for most of their young lives, "He asked me for my blessing yesterday," Joseph told Lucy one evening, as they sat together on the porch that had witnessed so many important conversations over the years of their marriage. "He wants to ask Emily to marry him." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, though her smile remained bright despite them. "Our boy getting married. I can hardly believe it, Joseph. It seems like only yesterday he was learning to walk in this very yard." "I gave him my blessing, of course," Joseph continued. "Emily is a fine young woman, and I have watched Daniel grow into a man of genuine character, someone who will make a wonderful husband, much as his own father did before him." "You mean Thomas," Lucy said softly. "I mean both of us," Joseph corrected gently. "Thomas gave him life, and I had the privilege of watching him grow into the man he has become. I believe we can both take credit in our own ways for the fine young man our son has turned out to be." Daniel and Emily married in the autumn of 1895, in the same small church where Joseph and Lucy had exchanged their own vows 15 years prior, and Joseph found himself overwhelmed with emotion as he watched his eldest son, the boy whose mother had placed him in his arms on that terrible and transformative day so many years ago, now beginning his own family with a young woman who clearly adored him. At the wedding celebration that followed, held on the Lawson Ranch with the whole town in attendance, Lucy found a quiet moment to speak with Joseph away from the noise and celebration, standing near the same fence post that Daniel had once helped his father mend, years before. "I have been thinking about that day again," Lucy said, watching Daniel and Emily dance together beneath strings of lanterns that had been hung for the occasion. "The day I placed him in your arms and walked away. I think about how frightened I was, how certain I was that I was making the wrong choice even as I made it, how I nearly turned back a dozen times as I walked toward that stagecoach." "What stopped you from turning back?" Joseph asked, a question he had wondered about for years but had never quite found the right moment to ask. Lucy considered this for a long moment before answering. "I think, in some way I could not fully articulate at the time, I recognized something in you, Joseph. Some quality of steadiness, of goodness beneath the rough exterior that your profession had built around you. I do not believe I consciously understood in that moment that I was not merely finding a caretaker for my son, but finding the man I would eventually come to love and build a life alongside. But some part of me must have sensed it, some intuition that told me this stranger, despite his reputation, despite the guns he carried, was someone I could trust with the most precious thing in my life. I am grateful, every single day, that your intuition proved correct," Joseph said, pulling her close against his side as they watched their son's wedding celebration continue around them. "You gave me everything, Lucy. Not just Daniel, though he alone would have been gift enough to change my life entirely. You gave me the chance to become a husband, a father to 4 children rather than 1, a rancher, a respected member of this community rather than a feared outlaw hunter with no place to call home. You gave me a reason to retire my guns and pick up something far more valuable, a life worth living rather than merely surviving. And you gave me the chance to love again," Lucy replied, when I believed my heart had been broken beyond repair by Thomas's death. You gave our son a father who has shown him, through 17 years of patient devotion, what it means to be a good man. You gave William and Sarah and Grace a father who has never once distinguished between the child he raised from infancy and the children we made together, loving all 4 of our children with the same complete devotion. They stood together in silence for a while longer, watching the celebration, watching their children, all 4 of them now, dance and laugh among the gathered friends and neighbors who had watched their unlikely love story unfold over the years. And Joseph felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought a grieving widow and a hardened gunslinger together on a dusty street in Kansas. Gratitude for the courage it had taken Lucy to trust him with her son. Gratitude for the letters that had allowed their hearts to find each other across the distance of Abilene and Redemption. Gratitude for every single day of the 17 years since. That fateful meeting that had transformed both of their lives so completely and so beautifully. As the sun began to set on Daniel's wedding day, painting the Kansas sky in the same brilliant colors that had accompanied so many significant moments in Joseph and Lucy's shared life, Joseph turned to his wife and spoke the words that had become something of a tradition between them, spoken on anniversaries and birthdays, and any occasion that called for reflection on the journey that had brought them to this moment. I retired my gun the day you handed me our son and walked away, he said, but I have never once felt as though I lost anything in that trade. I gained everything that truly matters, Lucy. I gained you, and Daniel, and William, and Sarah, and Grace, and this life we have built together in this town that gave us both a second chance at happiness. And I, Lucy replied, taking his weathered hand in hers, the same hand that had once held a gun with deadly precision, but now held nothing more dangerous than a hammer for mending fences or a pen for writing love letters that had never truly stopped, even after all these years of marriage. I gained a husband who chose love over violence, family over solitude, and who has shown our children, through every single day of his devotion, what it truly means to be a good man. They kissed then, softly, as the last light of the Kansas sunset faded into the deep blue of evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren yet to come, by the town that had witnessed their unlikely love story unfold from tragedy into triumph. And Joseph Lawson, former gunslinger turned rancher and devoted father and husband, understood with complete certainty that he had found, in this small town of Redemption, in this remarkable woman, and the son she had entrusted to his care, everything a man could ever hope to find in this life, and more happiness than he had ever believed himself capable of deserving. The years continued to unfold with the particular grace that comes from a life well lived and deeply loved. William eventually took over management of Lucy's dressmaking business, expanding it into a proper shop that served 3 counties by the time he reached adulthood. Sarah pursued her education further than most young women of her era, eventually becoming one of the first female teachers at the Redemption Schoolhouse, instructing a new generation of children in the same building where she herself had once learned her letters. Grace grew into a young woman with an insatiable curiosity about the natural world, eventually marrying a veterinarian who had come through Redemption and stayed, drawn as much by Grace's intelligence and warmth as by the opportunities the growing town offered his practice. Daniel and Emily gave Joseph and Lucy their first grandchild in 1897, a girl they named after her grandmother, Lucy Emily Ford, in honor of both the courage her great-grandmother had shown in the darkest days following Thomas Ford's murder, and the love that had grown from that tragedy into the flourishing family that now filled Redemption, with 3 generations of Lawsons and Fords intertwined by both blood and choice. Joseph lived to see his hair turn gray, to see his hands, once so quick and deadly with a Colt revolver, grow gentle with age as they cradled grandchildren rather than weapons, To see the town of Redemption grow from a small frontier settlement into a proper town with its own newspaper and telegraph office. And through every year of that long and remarkable transformation, he never once regretted the choice he had made on that dusty street in 1878. When a grieving widow had placed her son in his arms and walked away, unknowingly setting into motion the greatest love story either of them would ever know. Lucy, for her part, found in Joseph everything she had once believed she had lost forever with Thomas Ford's murder, a partner who respected her intelligence and her opinions, who never once made her feel less than an equal in their marriage despite the era's general expectations of feminine deference, who supported her business ambitions and celebrated her successes as though they were his own, which in truth, given the deeply intertwined nature of their partnership, they very much were. In their later years, sitting together on the same porch where they had shared so many important conversations over the decades, Joseph and Lucy would often reflect on the strange and beautiful path that had brought them together, marveling at how a moment of desperate sacrifice had transformed into a lifetime of profound joy, how a stranger's reputation for violence had given way to a reputation for gentleness and devotion that the entire town of Redemption had come to know and respect. "Do you regret it?" Lucy asked him once, near the end of their lives together, when both of them had grown old enough that their children had begun to worry over their health with the particular anxious devotion that adult children show toward aging parents. "Retiring so suddenly, giving up everything you had known for a baby that was not even your own blood." Joseph took her hand, weathered now with age but still soft in his grip, and shook his head with complete certainty. "I have never once regretted it, Lucy, not for a single moment across all these years. That baby, that moment, you, our children, our grandchildren, this town that welcomed us both when we needed welcoming most, this is the richest life I could ever have imagined, far richer than any bounty I might have collected chasing outlaws across the plains. I retired my gun that day, but I gained a heart, a family, a purpose beyond mere survival. I would make that same choice again, without a moment's hesitation, if given the chance to relive that day 1,000 times over." Lucy smiled at him then, the same smile that had captured his heart on that platform so many decades ago when she had stepped off the train to reclaim her son, and though neither of them had fully understood it in the moment, to claim Joseph's heart as well. "I love you, Joseph Lawson," she said, "more today than even on the day we married, more than I ever believed possible when I placed our son in your arms and walked away, praying desperately that I was making the right choice." "You made the right choice," Joseph said, echoing words he had spoken to her so many times over the years, words that had never lost their meaning despite their repetition. "You made the right choice for Daniel, and you made the right choice for both of us, though neither of us could have known it in that terrible, transformative moment." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over the Kansas plains, the same sun that had witnessed the beginning of their love story so many years before, and Joseph thought, as he often did in these quiet moments of reflection, about the strange mercy of fate that had guided a grieving widow to a hardened gunslinger on a dusty street in 1878, giving them both, through the gift of a small child, a second chance at love, at family, at the kind of deep and abiding happiness that neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding again after the losses that had shaped their earlier lives. Their story became something of a local legend in Redemption, told and retold over the years to new residents and curious children. The story of the gunslinger who retired the moment a widow handed him a baby and walked away, only to find, through that unexpected act of desperate trust, the family and the love that would define the rest of his days. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with the reunion on the train platform, with the wedding in the small church, with 4 children and eventually grandchildren filling a home that had once seemed destined to remain empty and solitary, with 2 hearts that had both known profound loss finding, against all odds, a lasting and beautiful happiness together in the town that had given them both a second chance at life. Joseph Lawson passed away peacefully in 1921, at the age of 77, surrounded by his wife of 41 years, his 4 children, and 11 grandchildren, in the same homestead he had built with his own hands after that fateful day when his life had changed forever. Lucy followed him 3 years later, having spent those final years telling and retelling their story to her great-grandchildren, ensuring that the tale of the gunslinger who had traded his guns for a family, who had found love not despite tragedy but somehow because of it, would live on in the memory of the family they had built together, a family born from desperate sacrifice and grown, through patient love and unwavering devotion, into something truly extraordinary.